Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our first plenary session. We're very, very honoured to have Professor David Bell, a graduate and professor at Princeton University. He's travelled all this way to give the lecture today. He regrets that he can't go into the battlefields of Europe or go to archives in France, but he is one of our most eminent historians of revolutionary France and thereafter, and it is indeed fitting that we have a speaker, a specialist of the old regime and the French Revolution at this conference, and it's even more appropriate since he's the article of the Global Turn so he's an author and a specialist of the subject of turning points, and we're looking forward to hearing what he has to say on his subject. He's a historian who has covered different types of history, to my mind, since he has looked at warfare in the First Total War, where he claims to have looking again at the start and the kind of wars that Europe has known, not just from the Great War. He has looked at political questions in the cult of the nation in France, and he's also looked at a particular group, lawyers and citizens, in the making of a political elite in old regime France. And he's currently completing other books. His book on Napoleon, A Concise Biography, is going to be out with Oxford University Press, as is Shadows of a Revolution, Reflections on have I got that title right? Reflections on the Revolution. So we're looking forward to his reflections on our topic of turning points, and I'm going to pass on the floor to him. So, David, welcome.
Thank you, Mara. I've had to make one last-minute change to my talk. I was going to start out by offering my very warm thanks to Dr. Rowlands for everything he's done for this invitation and for organizing the conference. I've had to change that now, anticipating slightly to thank Professor Rowlands. So thank you very much. He definitely deserves a round of applause. As we all know, let me see. Working? Yes, okay. So this is definitely a banner year for French anniversaries. We are marking 600 years from the Battle of Agincourt, 500 from the accession of François Ier, and of course it's been 300 since the death of Louis XIV, and 200 since the fall of Napoleon Bonaparte. Now, the organizers of the conference asked me to speak on anniversaries and turning points. They also asked me, please, to confine my remarks to periods of French history I actually know something about, so I will spare you my thoughts on the Battle of Agincourt, which consist of roughly 2 parts John Keegan to 1 part Shakespeare. More specifically, I was asked to speak about 1715 and 1815, what was important about each and what changed between these two dates. I'll confess that my first instinct on such a large topic was panic. My second instinct was to say that we're actually, in some ways, a year too late. Weren't the more important turning points really 1714 and 1814, the Peace of Utrecht and Napoleon's first defeat? The first of these ended one of the longest and most draining periods of warfare in French history and marked the start of over 40 years of relative calm and prosperity. Louis XIV's most important domestic reforms had already run out of steam well before 1714, and in this sense the king's death itself changed relatively little over the long term, despite the immediate turmoil that followed in the Regency. As for 1815, the sheer drama of the 100 Days in Waterloo still captivate, but with all due respect to Sir Edward Creasy, did the fate of the world really depend on what happened in 1815? At this stage, it was highly unlikely that Napoleon was ever going to win his larger empire back and challenge the hegemony of the Allies in Europe. Waterloo was above all about whether he was going to remain in power in France itself. It was 1814 that arguably marked a much more important shift in power. And years number 14 would also be quite nice banner years for French anniversaries, what with the opening of the Estates General in 1614, not to mention, as we all know from last year at great length, World War I. Still, since this is 2015, I'll be happy to talk about this year's 2 anniversaries and the century that elapsed in between. Now, having said this, I come back to my initial panic. It's obviously a pretty daunting task to try to generalize about any century of French history, to say nothing of this particular one. Matters are made even worse by the fact that in the judgment of some contemporary observers who were apparently anticipating Einstein's theory of relativity, considerably more than 100 years actually elapsed during the century in question. In 1794, Maximilien Robespierre asserted that since the start of the French Revolution, just 5 years before, the French nation had leapt 2,000 years ahead of the rest of the human race. During the Restoration, Chateaubriand mused that in the quarter century that had separated 1789 from the fall of Napoleon, several centuries had elapsed, and many other French people of the period made similar remarks about the apparent compression of time that they had experienced. I also can't help but note that the questions, what is the significance of these dates as turning points and what changed between them, makes a pretty good Rorschach test for historians. It reveals what they consider to be the most important factors in history in general. For instance, Alexis de Tocqueville obviously put a very strong emphasis on the long-term role of political institutions in history and the way that they shaped patterns of thought and action. So if we were to ask him what really mattered about 1715 and 1815 and what changed between them, his response might well have started, well, a lot less than you might think. Recall his wonderful lines about how just how much the people of the old regime in fact resembled those of his own day, thanks to the similarity of their institutions. He wrote, "They seem to stretch out their hands to each other across the gulf of the revolution that separates them." Now, Tocqueville himself, meanwhile, made all too little impression on the historians of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. They tended to place a lot more emphasis on political action and political ideology, and so they insisted that the French Revolution in particular changed almost everything. For a historian of the left like Alphonse Aulard, it did so favorably, bringing about liberty, civic equality, the rights of man, and finally the Republic. For counterparts on the right, like Hippolyte Taine, it did so malignantly, destroying an organic community centered on monarchy, nobility, and the Catholic faith. At about the same time, socialist historians were beginning to highlight the importance of the means of production. They therefore pointed to the 18th century as the moment that marked the definitive rise of a capitalist bourgeoisie over the ruins of an older feudal order. And for pretty much all of these late 19th century authors, the dates 1715 and 1815 paled in comparison to the monumental 1789. Getting closer to our own day, the answers changed yet again. Historians from the École des Annales, in its heyday, generally insisted that the most important historical changes were those affecting the largest number of people, which in France between 1715 and 1815 meant peasants. So these historians, to the extent that they even recognized turning points, because that would be, of course, histoire événementielle, but to the extent that they did see any real turning points, they would signal out the rather slower curves, in a sense, the century's population growth, its cycles of prosperity and hard times, and then if there was a turning point, it would be the revolution's destruction of the seigneurial order and the subsequent redistribution of land. So again, for them, there are really no turning points, just these curves, in a sense. Even more recently, there have been the representatives of the new cultural history who have focused on a broad range of cultural practices, from the way people relate to political authority, to the way they distinguish private from public, to gender relations and religious observances. They brought turning points back in as a concept, but for their analyses as well, 1789 has tended to loom far larger than 1715 or even 1815. Finally, historians from the even newer schools of global, Atlantic, imperial, and transnational history have come together in insisting we move the focus away from single countries to larger networks of trade, systems of empire, and the crises that befell both. Now, we'll come back to that most recent school in a moment. I'm going to talk about it at some length, in fact. But first, I just want to remark that having gone through this list and all these great predecessors, it would be more than a little presumptuous of me to say that, in fact, they all got it wrong. Let me, David Bell, tell you what really matters about these dates and what the real importance was. One of the points of the exercise I just went through was, in fact, to emphasize that none of these schools have been right or wrong. They've all contributed to our understanding of these dates and the century between them. So I'd like to do something a little bit different then, rather than trying to offer my own explanation of why this was all wrong in the past. What I'd like to do simply is to take a close look at the most recent of the approaches that I just described, the one that belongs, broadly speaking, under the sign of the global turn. This is where the greatest energies in the field have been concentrated of late, at least in the English-speaking world. If we want to ask what has changed most dramatically during the past couple of decades in the historical understanding of 1715 and 1815 and the century between, I think this is above all where it's most interesting to look right now. So I'd like to try to review what this turn, this global turn, has added to our understanding of the subject, and then also reflect a little bit on what it has not added. To what extent has it generated what Lynn Hunt has described as a much-needed new paradigm for the field? Where has it fallen short? Some of what I'm going to say is going to be a bit speculative, because at least as far as I'm aware, no historian has yet written a thorough book-length survey of French history between 1715 and 1815 from this perspective. There's been a great deal now of monographic research, also a profusion of short programmatic articles telling us what we should be doing, but relatively little that fills in the space between them. So I'll speculate a bit based on the existing work as to what a survey might look like, and then offer a kind of critique of it. So here goes. The survey would start with the notion that between 1715 and 1789, so not all the way through the century, the most important changes in French society were in fact driven by the booming Atlantic economy and by imperial competition with Great Britain. During this period, the value of American imports to France grew more than 11-fold. By 1789, they represented a third of total French imports. The number of slaves in the French Caribbean colonies, which is a horrific but telling measure of economic activity, rose 24-fold during the same period. By 1789, France's Caribbean colonies, which had a combined surface area about one-third of Scotland, held more slaves than the entire United States of America. In a matter of decades, Le Cap Français rose from virtually nothing to become one of the great cities of the Americas, a rival in wealth and population to Boston or Philadelphia, something we all too easily forget because of its destruction soon afterwards during the Haitian Revolution. Colonial trade arguably drove the expansion of the French economy in this period more than any other single factor. It drove the profusion of consumer goods available to ordinary French people, especially in cities, including coffee and chocolate, sugar, tobacco, calicos, even porcelain. It also did a great deal to make the French population more mobile and more cosmopolitan. The research that Emma Rothschild has been leading on Angoulême, here's one of her many diagrams from it, shows that even in Angoulême, an inland city that was often described as isolated and backwards, well over a quarter of the population had some sort of close contact with the world beyond France through a family member or neighbor, a brother in Saint-Domingue, a goddaughter married to a naval official, an uncle who had gone out to India, and so forth. And so while it's natural to see the French Empire contracting in the 18th century because of military defeat and the loss of territory, this research tells a different story. Territory may have been lost, the empire still became more important. Changes the nature, incidentally, of that other turning point in the century that was 1763. It becomes, in a sense, more of a blip than a total 180-degree turning point. And the rapid expansion of contacts and exchange had important social and political effects. As a number of historians, like Michael Quass and William Sewell, have argued, the consumer revolution that was centered on colonial goods gave French people new ways of making social distinctions, and therefore contributed to the corrosion of older concepts of social order. Quass has also shown in his new book called Contraband that ineffective government attempts to retain a monopoly over some of the colonial products helped to drive an epidemic of smuggling, which in turn prompted harsh countermeasures. And that, again in turn, kept alive a tradition of violent challenges to political authority, while it transformed the French fiscal administration into a potent symbol of despotism. Meanwhile, France's attempts to prevail, or eventually just to survive, in the imperial competition with Great Britain placed an enormous burden, of course, on France's antiquated, unwieldy, and desperately inefficient financial system. Attempts to impose new taxes led to corrosive episodes of political conflict, and never so more than in the last decades of the old regime, the last years of the old regime, when the debts that had been racked up during the American Revolutionary War pushed the system to the point of collapse. As Lynn Hunt has recently argued, the French government made the problem even worse when it tried to take advantage of the booming Atlantic trade in the 1780s and tied the state debt to investments in chartered trading companies, including a revived East India Company. It was the collapse of the resulting speculative bubble and the subsequent spike in interest rates that most immediately forced Louis XVI to seek public backing for the debt, which he ultimately had to do by convoking the Estates General. Imperial competition had further corrosive effects. The challenge of fighting major wars simultaneously on land and at sea proved too much for the French, as it had proved too much for the Dutch in the previous century. The result was a string of stunning humiliations at the hands of the powers that did not face this double challenge, namely Great Britain and Prussia. And these humiliations grievously weakened the political authority of the Bourbon monarchs. I don't think it's a coincidence that Keith Michael Baker once located the moment when France, quote, broke out of the absolutist mold in the year 1748, which happened to be the year of the deeply unsatisfying Peace of Aix-la-Chapelle, which forced Louis XV to have his own ally, Scottish ally, Charles Edward Stuart, arrested and expelled from the country in what was a terrific humiliation to the French crown. Now, from this perspective, of course, 1763 did amount to much more than just a blip. And in the 1780s, France's inability to protect its Dutch allies from Prussian invasion contributed even more to the climate of discontent. France's poor record on the battlefield prompted plans for military reforms, and these plans, bound up with concepts for a renewed nobility and even for citizen soldiers, quickly implicated important elements of the traditional social order. Finally, the thickening network of international contacts that developed in the 18th century had very broad and very deep cultural effects. As the anthropologist Michel Duché argued many years ago, one of the truly astonishing things about the French Enlightenment, which you can see here demonstrated quite graphically, was the sheer vast range of geographical and historical reference in its great works. The major philosophe wrote knowledgeably and at great length about China, about Russia, about the Middle East, North America, South America, India, and the other nations of Europe. Nothing like this had previously been seen in the history of Western thought. And these works systematically compared other parts of the world to France itself. Sometimes the comparison stigmatized the foreign places as inherently inferior or as occupying a more primitive position on a linear scale of social and cultural development. Sometimes the images produced were, of course, pure fantasies. But surprisingly often, they in fact amounted to what we today consider social science, and were deployed so as to drive home the point that different cultures may in fact possess different values, different standards of judgment. Remember the wonderful words of Montesquieu in Persian Letters. Our judgments proceed from a secret turning in that we make upon ourselves. I'm not surprised that Africans paint the devil in shining white and their own gods black as coal. It has been well said that if triangles were to make a god, they would give it 3 sides. It's hard not to conclude that these writings, taken together, help their readers see that existing French institutions, including deeply entrenched political and religious ones, did not have necessary and natural forms, but were perhaps as arbitrary and irrational as those in far-flung parts of the globe. At the same time, meanwhile, ethnographic observations of non-Europeans and the evidence they seem to provide for a linear scale of human progress led French thinkers like Buffon and Condorcet to the thrilling notion that humanity might in fact be almost indefinitely perfectible. As Buffon wrote, who knows to what point man might perfect either his moral or his physical nature. So if I were to offer a summary of the various changes I've discussed up to this point, it would go something like this. Between 1715 and 1789, thanks in large part to steadily intensifying forms of global exchange, the French population grew increasingly wealthy, mobile, and cosmopolitan. As a result, a large number of French people became increasingly used to defining social status by reference to a broad variety of products, including consumer products, and the liquid wealth necessary to acquire them, rather than to birth and title. The same patterns of exchange taught the French far more than they'd previously known about the world beyond their own borders, and therefore helped them see their own national institutions as the contingent and deeply imperfect products of arbitrary social and historical circumstance. Now, of course, you could say the same about other nations in the 18th century, notably Great Britain. But unlike the British, the French saw all too clearly that their own dauntingly complex, frequently paralytic political institutions were woefully ill-suited to the newly intense global competition that was accompanying these new forms of exchange. And that combination produced irresistible pressure for radical transformation. So let me now conclude this little speculative survey by continuing on to 1815. So the radical transformations, of course, came about in 1789, but as they did, arguably the same global forces that had done so much to bring the revolution about continued to have an important shaping influence on it. To begin with, of course, the revolution owed, as many of the revolutionaries said at the time, a great deal to the American example, which so many of the French, which they cited as a model. Meanwhile, the openness to the outside world that characterized so much of French Enlightenment thought most certainly strengthened the universalist tendencies within revolutionary thought, starting with the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. It's certainly no coincidence that the political faction most closely connected to the Atlantic port cities and to international trade, which is to say the Girondins, spoke in the most exalted universalist terms about the revolution's potential impact beyond France's borders. Recall the words of Brissot calling for war at the end of 1791. Remember those crusades in which Europe took up arms for a few superstitions? The moment has come for a new crusade, and it has a far nobler and holier object. It is crusade for universal liberty. And when the war began, the French tried to put this into practice to a certain extent by overturning local institutions and implanting new ones of their own in conquered territories in the name of universal principles. Nor were revolutionary politics and political institutions limited only to where the French armies conquered. Already 30 years ago, Jean Bouthier and Philippe Boutry showed that by 1794, over 230 political clubs around the world had formally affiliated with the Jacobins, including 3 in the Ottoman Empire and at least 2 among European soldiers in India. A further 36 clubs sprang up in the remains of the French overseas empire. At the same time, the continued existence of colonial slavery within the empire pointed more sharply than anything else could do to the limits of revolutionary universalism. From the very start of the revolution, the Société des Amis des Noirs pointed out the flagrant contradiction between proclaiming that men are born and remain free and equal in rights and keeping hundreds of thousands of human beings in bondage. The situation of the colonies quickly became a political issue of major importance, and one on which the radical revolutionaries could perhaps most clearly advance pure claims of conscience. Jeremy Popkin has pointed to the importance of Saint-Domingue in the debates of the National Assembly, and both he and Marcel d'Origny have suggested that the Amis des Noirs itself served as a precursor, perhaps even in some ways a model, for later militant political societies, including even the Jacobins. Popkin and Frédéric Réjean have argued that the colonial question helped to sharpen splits within the ranks of the revolutionaries, notably between Jacobins and Feuillants in 1791. More generally, I think it's also quite plausible to argue that the later split between the Girondins and their enemies on the left turned in large part around the question of how France would engage with the world beyond its borders. Not only do the Girondins speak in utopian terms about the revolution's universal appeal, they also tended to believe in a world united by peaceful commerce. Keith Baker has argued that they did not share the deep suspicion that classical Republican thinkers had traditionally expressed towards commerce. Instead, they sought to develop a distinctly modern version of republicanism that was compatible with trade and with global exchange. Yet even as Girondin figures like Condorcet or Thomas Paine were expounding on this theme, the Sans-Culottes and the Jacobins of the Mountain were expressing a newly intense hostility to commercial capital and to speculation, to joint stock companies, and indeed sometimes to foreign trade in general. Where did it go? There we go. An illustration from the Revolution illustrating les grandes menaces du commerce. The nature of the split became particularly clear during the Federalist revolts, which occurred in large part in commercial port cities. Consider the speech to the convention given by the Jacobin Fabre d'Églantine in August of 1793. It's time, he proclaimed, to put an end to this criminal commerce, and there's only one way to do it, namely cutting off our trade with foreign countries. And he added, it is precisely the most commercial towns that have demonstrated the greatest treason and lack of civisme. A similar hostility towards commerce and trading empires permeates, for example, the fulminations of Robespierre and Barrère against the British, and their eventual rejection of a broader revolutionary universalism in favor of a narrower French patriotism. Now, in 1794 to 95, the classical republican dream of an autarkic, anti-commercial French republic died, along with the Mountain and with the sans-culotte movement. The men who would rule France over the next 20 years, particularly Bonaparte, fully recognized the importance of a commercial economy and of global exchange. In fact, their failed attempts to reestablish France's global position arguably determined the course of French history more than anything else during this period. Napoleon Bonaparte, where is it? Come on. There we go. Napoleon Bonaparte, of course, made two attempts to restore a French overseas empire, first in Egypt, and then with the Leclerc expedition to Saint-Domingue. Both ended in disaster. He nursed hopes of invading Britain and challenging its naval power, ambitions destroyed largely at Trafalgar. He then attempted to strangle Britain by disrupting its global trade networks through closing off mainland Europe to British trade. But the Sisyphean attempt to control the continent's thousands of miles of coastline led fairly directly to his catastrophic campaigns in the Iberian Peninsula and in Russia, which together brought on his downfall. Now, these two familiar caricatures from the period, I think, testify quite well to the way that British observers indeed saw the struggle as a global one, a struggle for the control, particularly on the right here, control of transoceanic resources, dividing up the pie of the globe. Meanwhile, currents of revolutionary universalism continue to make themselves felt in Napoleon's annexations to his swelling empire, his attempt to impose uniform systems of law and administration through the empire, and the ambition he eventually developed, at least in the words remembered by Fouché, and I quote, of making all the peoples of Europe into a single people, and Paris the capital of the world. In short, it could be argued that the same global forces, which did so much to bring about the revolution, also arguably shaped the revolution's course with shifting ideologies, and then the nature of the Napoleonic regime that followed, as well as that regime's ultimate failure. And the ironic result is that at the end of a century which saw France engaged more intensely with global networks of exchange and competition than ever before in its history, it was left more thoroughly cut off from the world than at any time since well before 1715. So overseas trade in ruins, its port cities impoverished, its economy turning inwards, away from the coasts, and most impressively of all, the loss of almost all of its overseas empire. In 1715, France had ruled Saint-Domingue and Quebec, exercised a powerful influence throughout eastern India, had laid claim to about a third of the entire North American continent. 100 years later, nearly all was lost. What remained was islands: Guadeloupe, Martinique, Saint-Pierre, Miquelon, La Réunion, and so on. Not really so on very much. State of affairs wouldn't last. Less than 15 years after Waterloo, the French overseas empire would, of course, start its expansion again, and within a few decades would reach its greatest extension ever. But that falls beyond the scope of what I'm talking about. We'll hear more, I think, later this afternoon. Now, I hope I've done justice to this new global history and the way it's changed our understanding of this dauntingly eventful century. One thing worth noting is that in comparison with some of the other historical approaches I discussed earlier, the global one actually finds a great deal more importance as turning points in the dates 1715 and 1815. 1715 is a turning point from the global perspective because, again, the end of Louis XIV's reign and the Peace of Utrecht signify the end of a period in which French affairs were dominated by internal European warfare, and it signified the beginning of a long period of overseas expansion in which imperial competition became steadily more demanding. 1815 was a turning point for the reasons I was just elaborating on. It marks a deep, if brief, nadir in France's global fortunes. I think it's important for historians, even ones like me who do not work directly on global or Atlantic or transnational history, to recognize just how much has been gained from this new perspective. Many historians of early modern France, throughout much of the 20th century, many historians of early modern France seem to behave as if what happened across France's borders, and across those borders, and especially beyond on other sides of oceans, barely mattered. You could take semester-long courses in the history of 18th century France, as I did at Harvard and Princeton in the 1980s, and never hear a single mention of the colonies or of the Haitian Revolution. The work of the past generation has given us a much broader and more complete vision of the period that shows the importance of these things. It's also a vision that is, I will say, much better suited to the France of our own day, which is to say a multiracial France contending with global challenges of its own, although perhaps not always very successfully, again. I do think that some of the recent statements about the need to view 18th century France from a global perspective can be somewhat overblown. Although Emma Rothschild's work is fascinating and deeply promising, it still remains somewhat unclear to me what it actually meant to a person in Angoulême to have known somebody who had left France. How much did it actually change their perspectives? I think this needs to be followed up on. Yes, the revolutionary assemblies devoted a great deal of time to colonial affairs, but let's remember that the members of these assemblies were star athletes in the great political sport of competitive talking, and they spoke at often excruciating length on a very large number of subjects. What matters is not that they spoke a great deal about the colonial question, but how much they spoke about it in comparison with other things they spoke a great deal about, like grain prices, religion, war, the Constitution, the king, the army, education, taxes, privilege, and all the other subjects that did obsess the French assemblies during the Revolution. And in fact, the colonies don't really rank all that high on a truly comprehensive list of revolutionary legislative concerns. And while the colonial question certainly did divide Jacobins from Feuillants, and then Girondins from Montagnard and from Sans-Culottes, well, many things divided these eminently fractious groups. I don't think it likely that without the Société des Amis des Noirs, the Jacobins would not have come into existence. So I do think we have to be wary of too quickly dissolving France into a series of worldwide networks. I just don't think, for example, that there's evidence to support Gary Wilder's recent remark that we should see France in the period, and I'm quoting, as an imperial formation rather than a national state. I think we have to hold on to France as a national state in this period very much. I think Pierre Cernat, when he wrote a very thought-provoking article called "Every Revolution is a War of Independence," nonetheless may have exaggerated when he compared the social and political polarization within early modern metropolitan France to a process of colonization, and concluded that the French Revolution itself amounted to a struggle for decolonization within. But even where these articles may go a little far beyond the evidence, they are nonetheless provoking enormously useful debate and further research. Notably in the United States, where I'd say that at least 50% of the dissertations being written on this century of French history right now are either trying to place France into one or another sort of global context or engaging in one sort or another of global comparison. But just as we need to appreciate what the global turn has illuminated about this period, we need to appreciate what it can't easily illuminate. And I would propose, above all, it's simply not necessarily useful for illuminating instances of rapid historical change. Now, just to be a little more rigorous about what I mean by this, I think it's worth bringing into the discussion one of the most lucid and revealing recent contributions to the theorization of historical practice, namely William Sewell's book, Logics of History. Now, history written under the sign of the global turn generally fits what Sewell calls a structural view of social action. By this he means a mode of history writing that examines how things like the allocation of resources, forms of power, even governing ideas, are consistently reproduced even while consistently revising themselves until they have the force of material structures. Very familiar mode of history writing, of course, shared in many ways by Marxist history and Annales-style social history. And in one sense, history written under the sign of the global turn has in fact represented a return to an older structural mode of explanation that places much more emphasis on economics. When we tell stories about the expansion of trade, the founding of colonies, the creation of communications networks, or the development of armed forces, we are telling stories about various sorts of social structures. And this history can also, needless to say, illuminate the way in which such structures come under pressure, producing the potential for radical change. The stories told by global historians about the way French society and French government came under pressure in the late 18th century offers a perfect example. But what happens when the structures actually do break and radical change ensues? That's a different matter. William Sewell observes the following, and I quote, "Initially localized ruptures have the potential of bringing about a cascading series of further ruptures that result in structural transformations. Crucially, the nature of these further ruptures, and this is, I think, the crucial point, it cannot be deduced simply from the structural configuration that preceded them. Things don't break along a fault line and then just stay within the configuration of that fault line. They take place according to a logic that only develops after the initial ruptures have taken place. In other words, the process that actually produces a structural transformation is a dynamic process. It's one that builds on itself and it can even gain momentum as it unrolls. The paradigmatic pre-modern examples of such intense and dynamic instances of transformation were radical religious movements, Reformation above all, in European history. The paradigmatic modern examples are political revolutions. And in both cases, a great deal about the phenomenon is actually quite impervious to structural analysis alone. Structural analysis can show how various forms of deep-seated contradiction and pressure could build up to where rupture became likely. But it cannot explain everything about why the change then took the form it did. In the case of the French Revolution of 1789, again, placing the event in global perspective gives a new and powerful sense of the ways in which overwhelming pressure did build up on state institutions that had not adapted to the new global realities. It shows why some sort of revolutionary change was very likely to happen. And it can also show how global forces continued to act on France during the course of the revolution and afterwards. But there's still so much about this dynamic process of radicalization that the story doesn't even begin to account for. In about the time that a modern undergraduate takes to complete a degree here in the UK, a country that had taken monarchy and the Catholic Church almost entirely for granted as the bedrock upon which everything else rested, became a country where millions of people proudly proclaimed themselves Democrats and Republicans, reviled the king as a traitor, denounced Catholicism as a rather corrupt form of black magic. A country that had avoided large-scale internecine bloodshed for more than a century fell into one of the most destructive and multifaceted civil wars in its history, taking hundreds of thousands of lives. In the extraordinary years 1793-94, the French explored new frontiers of utopian hope and new frontiers of political horror. A structural analysis is just not going to help us understand much about these developments. This was the realization that led François Furet to write the history of the revolution in such a dramatically new way, and then encouraged a generation of historians of political culture to follow him. These historians understood that the dynamic, cascading process of radicalization took place first and foremost in people's heads. It involved the invention of new ideas, new modes of thought, and as such it called for analysis with the tools of intellectual and cultural history. One great example, famously analyzed by Keith Baker, is the concept of revolution itself. Before the 1780s, the word meant essentially a rapid, unpredictable, uncontrollable upheaval. A revolution was held to strike a country in much the same way that an earthquake or a plague might have done. And in fact, one of the books whose titles I'm showing here, these old Histoire des Révolutions of X, Y, and Z, one of these books actually is about revolutions of the earth that were in fact earthquakes and not political revolutions. But in the crucible of political thought and action, that was the France of the Revolution, a new concept was born. The word revolution came to signify an ongoing, deliberate process driven and controlled by political will. And the people committed to this process could now be called revolutionaries, a word that itself had not existed previously and would have made little sense previously. Things could be described with a new adjective, revolutionary, a new word. People could even claim to speak in the name of the revolution, again a formulation that would have made no sense to anybody in 1780. And even after the radical energies of the revolution did drain away and the republic gave way to the empire, this idea of revolution remained, inspiring to some, terrifying to others, significant to all. In France in 1815, virtually everyone knew and cared one way or the other about this thing that would have been unimaginable, quite literally, to their great-grandparents, a revolution, a promise of transcendence as powerful, I would argue, as anything since the coming of Christianity. So to come back to the little exercise with which I started this talk, some schools of historians may not in fact choose to call this change, the birth of the modern idea of revolution, particularly important. But if you do consider it important and you want to understand how it came into being, it's not enough to look at the background structural conditions. You have to look at the intense dynamic process that took place after the structures broke down, at the events of the revolution, at the ideas that circulated so rapidly and powerfully and transformatively during them, and ultimately at the language itself. To do this again, the most useful tools are the ones developed not after the global turn, but after the linguistic turn. Some historians writing under the sign of the global turn may indeed wish to dismiss this change, and indeed the entire ideological upheaval of the French Revolution, as comparatively unimportant. In his recent fascinating and provocative article, Pierre Sarnat wrote, and I quote, "Today, 1789, is interesting only when considered as an illustration of the revolution of the Atlantic world." Only interesting. He redefines the revolution as, and I'm quoting, "a war of independence against the Versailles monarchy," and says that it was, and I quote again, "far from being radically different from other revolutions of the period, which were similarly best seen as wars of independence against elite centers of power." Now, from my own perspective as an historian of political culture, I would, of course, disagree with these statements. But more to the point, I think that from the perspective of global history, they're actually somewhat misleading. Because from the global perspective, the significance of the French Revolution doesn't really lie in its place in a broader Atlantic revolution and its similarity to wars of decolonization. And it doesn't lie in the way it offers an example of a state collapsing as a result of unsustainable structural pressure. The revolution's global significance lies precisely in the new ideas and practices that it generated, and in the way that these ideas and practices flowed outwards from France, inspiring countless revolutionaries and reformers around the globe, while horrifying many others. Oops, sorry. I thought I had another slide there. There's a reason that France, far more than other countries, was so identified with the idea of revolution for more than a century after 1789, and still today in many ways. It's because what happened in France was so different and so much more ambitious than in the other revolutions of the age. And again, what was important was what had developed in the years after the old regime monarchy had collapsed, in that intense period of time when Robespierre saw the French sleeping 2,000 years ahead of the rest of the human race. This intense period, this crucible of modern politics, can only be understood by looking at the events and ideas and the dynamic processes that ran through them. So to put things in a nutshell, the global perspective cannot actually on its own explain why the French Revolution became an event of global significance. It's worth repeating, the global perspective cannot explain why the revolution became an event of global significance. As I said before, in some ways the global perspective does seem to better explain the long-term significance of the two anniversaries we're celebrating this year, since again one marked more or less the beginning of this long phase of French expansion, and the second a nadir in France's overseas efforts. But in fact, if we don't take into account the things I've just been discussing, I think we miss something very important about the year 1815 in particular, and actually, I hate to say this, sorry guy, in the way that it was not a turning point. Because 200 years ago, France was indeed defeated, exhausted, exsanguinated, shrunken in size, curtailed in its overseas trade, and virtually denuded of its overseas possessions. Yet even in this pitiful state, it remained an extraordinary focus of worldwide attention, and not just because of the drama of Napoleon and the 100 Days. It remained one of the most potent symbols of political hope and political peril that the world had ever known, and this was because of the incredible events of the Revolution. So I hope that this point justifies why, after having been invited to speak about 1715 and 1815, I have indeed, as befits a historian of the Revolution, spent so much time this afternoon on 1789. But after all, what Victor Hugo wrote about the convention could very well be said about the Revolution itself. To quote his great novel, which commemorates yet another great turning point, 1793, "Whenever it appears before the mind of a man, whether he be an historian or philosopher, this man stops and ponders. Impossible not to be attentive to this great passage of shadows. Impossible de ne pas être attentif à ce grand passage d'ombre." Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, David. That was
Should I stay here to answer questions? Or?
Questions.
Do you have some water there, David?
Over here, sure, that's fine. Thank you.
You have some water.
Even better, I have coffee.
So after that wonderful perspective that you've given us of terms, you mentioned the linguistic term, the global term was dominant, the global perspective on France. I invite questions from the floor.
David, that was fantastic. A question about, it seems to me that Furet, who drew on de Tocqueville, had two components to his argument. One was ideological, as it was for de Tocqueville. The abstract literary politics creates new ways of thinking that have these nefarious effects afterwards because they're too abstract. But de Tocqueville also had an argument that was sociological, and it was about state centralization. And so to subscribe to your interpretation there of the French Revolution, does that compel us to put aside state centralization as an issue in the French Revolution? Because that is a structure, that is an institutional dynamic that's inherited from the old regime and carried on.
Well, that's a really good question. I think that, presumably, in this sort of global interpretation which I've sketched out, centralization is of course part of the story, but it becomes part of the story because of the way it contributes to the inability of France to compete and adjust. Presumably, in actually the failure of one of the most important forms of centralization, which would be a true financial centralization, which did not happen. The creation of effective central financial institutions, which only come about in the 19th century. So that would be one part of the story, and also, one could go back, for example, and I'm drawing on other people's work here. I'm drawing, for example, on Michael Klaus's work, the way in which the state centralization leads the state to try to control, the kind of, internal progress of this trade in such a ham-handed and inefficient way that it simply spurs this huge sort of flood of internal contestation that keeps alive a kind of tradition of internal contestation that might otherwise, in a relatively peaceful century, have had much less importance. As Klaus points out, what was the first thing that the rioters destroy in July of 1789? They destroyed the customs barriers in Paris. So, that would be, so again, it's not in any way a question of rejecting this, but it would then be a question of integrating it into this and seeing where it contributes to the pressure points themselves. And there would certainly be a difference from Tocqueville, because there would be much less emphasis on the way that centralization itself may produce a crisis, but more the way centralization in combination with these other broader factors produces a crisis.
Any question? Is there a question?
Yeah, looking behind this talk, I hear a larger series of questions about what we as historians do as teachers, and also the question of what our best connection to the outside world is, specifically this sort of debate that took place over the past year involving microhistory or so-called microhistory. And I wonder,
You're thinking of the History Manifesto, or
yes? Of course I'm thinking. Yeah. So I hear a response, a shadow response to that here, and wondered if you could talk a little bit more about that whole line of discussion when one thinks in terms of turning points or history, digging deeply into histories of events versus taking this much sort of looking at things as being important because of how connected they are to all kinds of other things in ways that you can trace. I wonder if you've just had some reflections on that.
I certainly agree with you. I think that those concerns are lurking behind what I was saying. I think that it is very laudable, to the extent that this shift in the profession has often very, very self-consciously positioned itself as responding to globalization, new forms of global realities, and so forth. And to the extent that it is, of course, trying to, both explain and put in perspective these things of our own day. Who could possibly argue with that? It's perfect, entirely valid and necessary process. But what it can do is, of course, it leads us to forget certain things. This is what happens with any such turn. And we take far too much for granted what certain older generations of historians appreciated, and this happens again and again. So that do you want to respond to that, or?
Yeah, I think, and what comes out so deeply from what you've talked about is the way that somebody like Hugo pulls at us, pulls us in to just how fascinating and how important the developments of the revolutionary era that you talked about, those 3 short years, or of what he says so profoundly here at the end. So I think I want to thank you for bringing that back to life also in the course of making your argument.
I think one thing probably is that, it's now, the whole sort of notion of political revolution seems to be more or less at an end worldwide now, and people have not themselves experienced this kind of thing. The last, where is there a revolutionary movement today that really inspires a lot of people? I mean, it's not very clear. And where is there an example of this kind of transformation that anybody really, beyond a few, the last Maoists hanging on in the Fifth Arrondissement? I mean, where, do they really find compelling? So I think that's part of it. Is our inability to, our lack of experience with this sort of thing does hurt our ability to really understand how absolutely extraordinary and transformative it could be.
So, I forgot to say, could you mention who you are? Could you tell us your name, please?
My name is Catherine Thomas.
Right. From?
Various places, Hopkins and State High School in Washington.
Thank you, Catherine. Jeffrey, I know you soon. And then so if you could just say your name from...
Jeffrey from Yale University College. I really enjoyed the talk. This is going to sound like a slightly belligerent question, but I really enjoyed the talk, and I agree with what you said for the most part, but there was one throwaway comment or short comment you made towards the end where you said that the real significance of the French Revolution is that it's more radical and more transformative. And I wonder, would you really say that in comparison to the Haitian Revolution, which is the only successful sort of revolt in world war history? Would you say the French Revolution is more radical and transformative than that?
I wasn't saying that it was more radical and transformative in my own view, but certainly in the view of most people around the world in the 19th century, yeah. It absolutely was. I mean, we may like to talk today about how, the importance of the Haitian Revolution and to reassert that, but you cannot possibly compare the way that people around the world perceived the Haitian Revolution to the way they perceived the French one. In 1917, the Bolsheviks were all asking themselves, which one of us is Napoleon, which one of us is Brissot. They were not asking which one is Toussaint, which one is Dessalines. They didn't probably even know the names. And that's telling. I mean, we may disagree with it from our own perspective, and I think we'd be right to, as you say, but, there is no comparison.
Good question?
Yeah, thanks. So my name is Aro Bellman. I'm from NYU. Again, very much enjoyed your talk. I was struck by the use of your use of Sewell in illustrating this, the way that global history has to be structural rather than focusing on the structures that Sewell talks about it. The reason I was struck by that was because, of course, the example that Sewell uses to illustrate the rupture is the death of Captain Cook.
Well, it's one of two examples he gives. The other one is the fall of the Bastille.
Yeah. And that is one of those examples where in order to understand this particular rupture, you have to understand both the society and culture of the Hawaiian tribe, the fact that
absolutely.
When the Cook arrives, when he does, as opposed to at a different time when he can be considered to be a god. And you also have to understand Cook's context, why he's traveling when he's traveling. So I'm wondering whether the global turn, as you're describing it, doesn't resemble more that example of Sewell's rather than the example that sort of focuses on the structure at the expense of corruption.
Well, I think actually, in some ways, the two examples that Sewell gives. I mean, we almost instinctively separate the fall of the Bastille from Captain Cook, but I'm saying one is global and one is metropolitan, right? But in fact, I mean, both of them for him function in more or less the same way. And I think the point I'm simply trying to say is that in either case, there are global factors behind the fall of the Bastille as well, which is what I was trying to talk about here. But it's what happens afterwards, and within that, and of course it's influenced. Of course, absolutely, it's influenced, and I was trying to say that it's influenced by the global factors. But there is a dynamic that evolves on the ground within, and which cannot simply be predicted from the initial structural configuration. That's, I think, the important point, and depending on where it happens, these events may be considered sort of more global or less, but there is a dynamic that happens in a very small space in a very intense way, and there has to be attention paid to that. To the extent that global historians are going to do that, examples like Captain Cook, that's fine, but there's a tendency when it comes to purely metropolitan events like the French Revolution to say, well, whereas this was just European, it was just these dead white men fighting with each other, and so it's not really global and it can't really be that important, and that's what I'm trying to push back against.
Laurie?
Hi, thank you for that. That was really interesting. Laurie Leos from the University of Exeter. And global and imperial history is really big at Exeter right now. So I'm one of those PhD students who's been led down the road using global and imperial methodology that you're talking about. I thought it was interesting that you didn't mention the Concert of Europe. And that a number of historians, of course, have written on that as a kind of a major turning point in French European history. And
Sorry, is it the Concert of Europe? Yeah.
And of course, that's seen as heralding a new era of peace. And it presumably exists because we're in this new era of global connectivity. So I'm just wondering if you reject the idea that this is something different than existed previously.
Well, I mean, I didn't address it particularly because I was really trying to focus on, I'm a historian of France, and I was really trying to focus on the significance here for the history of France. I mean, I would agree with you, actually, about the Concert of Europe, but this is introducing something which really goes beyond simply the scope of what I was trying to talk about.
Other questions? Yes.
Jack, Roger. I wondered if it's not like, I wondered if you talked about the focus on global history, of being very aware of how the world is cut, and it's a response to the last, say, 2 decades, especially referring to rise in Asia. I wonder if it's more that historians are trying to predict what's going to be important, and so
We're very bad at that.
and so the global turn is us essentially assuming what the future is going to be, and so leaning towards producing histories that are going to look more relevant. I wondered if you thought about that.
I mean, I just go back to what I said in my response to Catherine. I mean, I think these, it always has been a kind of game of catch up more than anything else, and I'm not really sure that maybe people are. I don't know. No, I'm not really sure how I'd answer that. I mean, I don't see efforts to. I'm not sure about people predicting what they think is going to be important by looking back. I'm sorry, I'm not being very coherent here, but I'm not sure how to answer it.
Well, while you're thinking about it, Thomas has a question, and then.
Thomas Dalton from Boston College. Thanks, David. As I think you know, I'm very sympathetic to the kind of position that you're arguing for. I'm wondering if do you think there is a way in which the global perspective need not necessarily be structural and responsive? Is there a way in which, is Emma Rothschild's attempt one way of trying to sort of looking at metropolitan colony as both dynamic agents? I'm just sort of curious about whether you think it necessarily has to be a sort of structural conjuncture that one, or whether it can be done another way.
No, it's a great question. I don't think it has to be at all, but I do think that the way that it has so far played out has been at least as it impinges. I wouldn't presume to speak about the global turn as a whole in history, but as it has impinged the study of France in this period, I think most successfully the work it has been tended to be more structural in its effects.
And can I just put it?
Sure.
Is that because of the sort of economic turn? I sort of sense that might be what you were pointing towards. Is that the case? Or?
I think that's the case, and also I think it's because there has been. There's certainly been a great, and I didn't talk about this as much, but there has been, a great effort made to look at the way that the global changes redounded upon France itself, particularly during the Revolution, because. Talking about the global effects of the French Revolution is nothing new. Talking about the importance of global trade, well, Jaurès had some very nice pages about that in his Histoire socialiste de la Révolution française in the 19th century. What a lot of the focus of the new work, particularly by people like Jeremy Popcorn and Frédéric Réjean, has been to try to show how this really sort of impinged upon what was going on in France. But that I find has not really been as successful. I'm happy to. I'm very open to efforts to do it in a way that might be more successful. Again, I'm simply talking about quoting the number of times that somebody in the Constituant mentions les colonies. By itself, it does not actually tell us as much as we might hope. And I think that when that's certainly. Pierre Sarnat tried to make an argument once about how how everybody's using the language of slavery. But that's a very tricky thing. To what extent are you talking, sometimes they're talking about a servitude, sometimes they're talking very clearly about serfs, sometimes they're talking about Roman slaves and Greek slaves. To what extent, we have to remember that in some ways we have a much more sort of piercing awareness of what the realities of colonial slavery were like than they did in Paris in 1789. So we have to be careful not to project our own consciousness of this back onto them so easily, as I think some historians have tended to do. So again, it's simply I'm certainly open to non-structural approaches here. And one of the things which is, of course, has made the global turn so fuzzy is that there are so many different sort of theoretical positions within it. But I think we're still waiting for something that's really going to transform the field. That's going to come out of the global turn and address these dynamic, moments of dynamic change.
University in Buffalo. I don't know if it's quite to the topic, but one of the aspects of this global turn, as I've experienced it in my university, is the notion of the mutual constitution, so that you no longer have a France. You have a France that is influenced by what is going on, not just in trade, but in its colonies, and similarly institutions. French institutions don't really matter when it comes to Saint-Domingue or Louisiana, because people are creating their own local version. And your argument of where is France in all that is something that preoccupies me, and I wonder if it's part of what you're trying to say today.
Well, yes, very much. I mean, and I think, this is often very important. I think it explains, this whole notion of this sort of mutual constitution. It explains a great deal about what happens in the 18th century, and I think we need to take it very seriously. But again, it tends to explain certain things quite well when it comes to how you get in 4 years from the fall of the Bastille to the Terror. I'm not sure that, as I was saying to Tom there, I'm not sure that bringing in the same process of mutual constitution really makes a lot of sense, because you have to concentrate on what's going on in very small spaces in very short periods of time, with so much going on that there's not always a great awareness of what's happening, and it's not unclear just how much what's happening there is really impinging upon what happens. I mean, and again, to come back to what the answer I gave to Tom, I mean, one of the clearest ways in which there is a process of mutual constitution is through commerce, through changes in trade and so on and so forth, which have enormous effects on the economy, and which have further sort of lead to further compounding changes in France itself. But it's very different from the kind of change which we see in the revolutionary years. So again, it works for certain things, but let's be careful before we take it for a model of how everything works, which is what the position some global historians are taking.
Any other questions? Yes, one at the back.
How well do you think the historiography has grasped the difference between what looks global to us in hindsight and what looks, for want of a better word, global to contemporaries at the time? It seems to me that might be another issue where the difference between structure and voluntarism comes in. Is that it's very easy for us to write things global knowing how the story works.
Yes.
But a lot of the things that we might think were global, contemporaries define in very different ways. In fact, local, as it were. So do you think that historiography has been able to incorporate that, or do you see any particularly successful examples?
Well, I mean, I guess my first response to that would be to say that actually one thing that happened with the linguistic turn is perhaps it encouraged us to show a little too much deference to the way that the people at the time saw things, because I think it's very important to look back. I mean, clearly, the whole language which we're talking about, the global turn, would have been very foreign to most people in 18th century France, and yet it has a very important heuristic. It actually shows us something which is quite profound about what actually happened then. So I think we don't have to necessarily be entirely respectful of the way they saw things, but nonetheless, I think I would agree with you that there are a lot of things that they would not have seen happening in global terms at all. I'm not sure I can think off the top of my head to a particular piece of thing that would illustrate that, but I would certainly agree with your point. So.
Well, I think on that note, we will leave the interrogation. And thank you, David, for answering all those questions. And once again, thank you.
Thank you very much.